All right, welcome to the Time for Genetics family conversation. We are glad you all are here. Thank you so much for being here today. Today we're in the topic area of autism, and so this is our last month of the 4 months that we've spent on autism. And today we're going to visit family perspectives on autism and genetics. As always, we start off with our HRSA funding statement. All of this is possible because of the support we receive from the Health Resources and Service Administration. If you want any more information on that, you can visit hrsa.gov. I'm Christy. I'm the projects manager for Mountain States and the lead for the Time for Genetics initiative. And if you have any questions or comments, you can chat to me, or I am joined also by Michaela, our projects coordinator today, so she can help in the chat if you have any questions. So as most of you know who are participating, our Time for Genetics initiative is our pediatric primary care genetics initiative in the Mountain States region. We have 18 clinics 18 clinics participating in cohort 1 and cohort 2. You can see the map on the right. The yellow pins are cohort 1 and the orange pins are cohort 2. And we are recruiting right now for cohort number 3. We have 20 spots available in all of our states. Our goal is to have 5 pins in each state, or 5 clinics in each state participating by January, because that will be our last cohort. So our applications are open now until January 15th of 2023. If you have any ideas of folks that might be wanting to join us for that, we have all of the info on a landing page called T4 Info, and happy to talk with any of folks that are interested, any of the clinics that are interested in participating if they'd like more details or information. With that, I'd like to introduce our 3 guests today with us. We have Adrienne joining us from Colorado, Robert joining us from Arizona, and Heidi joining us from Utah. And we were going to start off with Heidi, but Heidi, if you don't mind me just asking, Robert, would it be better for you if you went first? Because I know you have to jump off.
Yeah, that probably makes some sense.
Would that be okay?
Yes.
All right, I'm going to stop my sharing so we can see you, and I will turn it over to you to share your story, and then we'll go ahead and pop back over to Heidi.
All right, let me pull up my cheat sheet here. Right?
Yeah, no worries.
Story starters. My name's Robert Swirsky, and when was your child diagnosed? Was your child diagnosed with autism or a genetic condition first? We were diagnosed with DUP15Q first. He was 14 months old. He's missing his milestones, but there didn't seem to be a whole lot of concern, which retrospectively, looking back, there should have probably been some more. He had torticollis with the head thing. He had hypotonia. His mom had gotten him, I think she called it a bop or something, to sit him up in at the on the floor and these kinds of things. Because there he is. He stayed home from school today. He slept in a little late. So he was missing milestones, and so at about 14 months, they decided to run a bunch of tests just to make sure he was a late bloomer on the walk, because he wasn't walking yet, that kind of thing. And the way I tell the story is I had decent insurance, so I guess that's why he ran all these tests. One of the tests was a genetics test, which he assumed was going to come back negative, for anything out of the ordinary. And then I got that. I got a 9 a.m. morning phone call, and I guess he had said wait till next week to tell him, or something. And so that's how that happened. And then it would be later on that we found out about the autism. And that came as in this. The way it rolled out is when we got the diagnosis on the phone, I said, what do I got to do? I said, is there any way this is going to just be okay? And he goes, no, it's not going to be okay. And so there was a geneticist had an opening and she had a cancellation. I called the geneticist. He gave me the number to immediately after I got off the phone. So we were down there in about 2 hours, and she didn't know what Duke 15Q was. And she gave us a couple of sheets she printed out from the NIH about Duke 15Q. And I think she gave us the number for or the contact info for Unique, the rare chromosome clearinghouse over in England. And that was our first information. That's where we started to read about autism and about this and that. And we saw some pretty ugly pictures of kids in there, ugly in terms of course, their disability. And then I think it was them who got us over to the Alliance, to 15Q Alliance. But after the diagnosis, I made a call. I work with a lot of physicians, so I made a call to a developmental pediatrician who teaches out of University of Chicago, and she gave me the name of Raoul Melmed, who, if you know SARC, anybody know SARC? Southwest Autism Research, and yeah, he was a founder of that. But anyway, so we went up to him, and that's where he was able to give us a little bit more information on the autism nature. And then his office also did the autism. We had a developmental peds there, did the autism diagnosis. And I think he said it couldn't happen for a year or two. What did he have to be, like 3 or something? This was 13 years ago. So that's how we got that diagnosis. They were similar, different. I guess they were about the same. What was helpful from each experience? Well, the autism one, I really didn't know what was going on. I mean, you just kind of put them in, or at least for me, it was just kind of put them in the room, and they did something with them, and I wasn't really knowledgeable on it either. And I would learn more later. But now, even with his autism, and I don't know for the folks from the field, but one of the things that I always tell people is that when he's autistic, and that they know that it comes from the genetic situation, and that if your kid's autistic, you ought to have them genetically tested. Maybe you'll come up with a reason, maybe you won't, but at least you'll be able to eliminate some things. But ours tend to be much more social than typical autistic kids, if there is such a thing. And we found that just amongst the parents. And when you take them out, it's obvious. Holden goes to an autism charter school, and he's like the big man on the campus because he's very verbal and fun and that kind of thing. I mean, we've had a ton of behaviors and seizures and all this kind of stuff too. But compare whatever you want to say it, juxtaposed to a normal typical autistic features, you see them, but they're more hidden, much more hidden than they would be on a normal autistic kid. You wouldn't know my guy's autistic in the supermarket unless he started doing behaviors, and some of his behaviors are very autistic, but they don't come out, they don't present quite the same way, I think. So that would be one of the things. What are the barriers did you face in diagnosis and treatment of both diagnoses? I think with the autism one, they tend to lump us all together, and I find myself often feeling that I have to explain, whether I do or not, I don't know sometimes, but that his autism is a result of the Duke 15Q. His seizures are a result of the Duke 15Q. He's not autistic and Duke 15Q. He's autistic because he's Duke 15Q. And there's a big difference just in those little words. And that gives hope for answers. And then I'll talk to autistic people, about or parents that they're making inroads in research, and we're really getting closer to finding out some answers, but we need more data, and that's where the genetic testing comes in. And I don't know what else to do past that, but I do that all the time. I mean, that's like normal operating procedure for me. is in the supermarket, wherever. Because one of the things with Holden is he'll go up to people and he'll start a conversation and they won't quite know what he's talking about or why or any of that. And then I'll chime in and tell him, well, he's duplication 15Q, blah, blah, blah. And I go into my little, you guys call, I never heard of pop-up meetings until I was in New Mexico a couple of years ago with y'all, but that's my pop-up meetings. I mean, they happen all the time at the supermarket or wherever, so, so the barriers, I mean, the biggest barriers is lack of knowledge of Duke 15Q, but I think that's changing quickly. And when I'm explaining Duke 15Q, I jump into Angelman, Prader-Willis, especially if somebody's got a little medical training, because they haven't heard of Duke, but most of them have heard of Angelman's if they have any medical training at all from that. So I'll use that as a little bit, but and then, like I said, with the autism, it just seems that they maybe they treat autism too generically. I mean, now because there's so many or something. From that standpoint, maybe physicians ought to be asking more of, can we, what are some possible things that this kid's came from, or something? I don't know. What advice do you have for PCPs when interacting? There you go, with families who may be in a similar situation. I think more questions need to be, there's so many autism diagnoses coming out that you get this autism diagnosis and you go this route that's been paved before you by other parents, but all that's doing is railroading everybody down. It's not getting any answers. It's not finding out the differences from one to another, why there are differences from one autistic kid to another. We're just lumping them all together like that. I don't know. Maybe they need to, and I'm off topic now, but maybe they need to split up how they look at the diagnosis into different. I know we have loose gradations. He's worse off than that one. But maybe maybe it's time for some sort of gradation type thing, and then we can start to figure out where some of them. I don't know. I'll shut up now because of the topic.
Thank you, Robert.
But that's better. My ADHD is getting better.
Thank you so much for sharing that story, your story, you and your son's story. Is there any advice that I think you started to say some, but is there any advice that you would have for PCPs or pediatricians, just maybe in the moment of diagnosis of either of those?
Well, I'm a big supporter of that a genetic test goes with an autism diagnosis. I mean, there's no two ways, because without what we have, and maybe this is the best part of my talk, without what we have in terms of the support of the Duke 15Q Alliance, I'm a solo parent, a 59-year-old dad of a 13-year-old Duke 15Q guy, and I have no family around that can, help or anything like that. And without the Duke 15Q Alliance, and the only reason we got set up with them was because of the genetic test. But they've been I cannot imagine life. I don't know whether I would have had to, I don't know, lack of a better word, turn the kid into the state or something. I mean, I would just be clueless as to what the hell to do. And knowing why your kid is some way. I mean, if you've ever had a child with some sort of condition, I mean, it's so huge to know why they're this way or that way, and so that you have a chance of using it for the child's better, whether it's treating it, getting early interventions, or maybe it's a good feature and you want to emphasize it and help it to grow.
So for you,
that was really all.
Go ahead.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Go on. So if we didn't have a genetic test, we wouldn't have found the Duke 15Q, and we're in the same boat as everybody else, wandering around. I got an autistic kid. I got an autistic kid. I got and meanwhile, mine's having seizures and all this other, it's just not good. Having had a genetics test and not and people that haven't, there is no way in hell I would not have one.
So for
maybe
you, it
that's the
sounds
bottom
like
line.
it really opened the door to support for you and your family. You
Yeah,
specifically.
it's night and day knowing why your child, and
Yeah.
and so like I said, so you can address it properly and the best way you can.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing that. And I know you might have to run, so if you do, just turn your camera off, and we'll talk to you later. But with that, I'll go ahead and pass it over.
Yeah, I might turn the camera off and leave the audio on and get him ready. Okay?
No worries.
Yep.
And I'll pass it over to Heidi, if that's okay. Heidi is from Utah. And Heidi, would you like to introduce yourself and tell a little bit about your story? And I'll spotlight you here so everybody can see you.
Sure. So I am from Utah. I'm part of the Utah team of Mountain States. And
hello. Hey, we get ready to go.
And I have 2 kids with creatine deficiency. And like everybody's story, we had a child where it was our first child, and we thought everything was great. She had a fairly uneventful birth, and she seemed to be growing and healthy, and she was engaging and laughing and making eye contact. But she was a little slow with her motor skills. So she was a little slow with sitting up and rolling over, and she wasn't really crawling and up off the ground until about 12 months. And at 18 months, she finally started really walking, letting go of things. And her pediatrician was like, oh, that's just in time. If it went past 18 months, that's when we get physical therapy involved. And so then the focus, of course, started turning towards speech and those kinds of milestones. And she was not hitting them. And so she started the state early intervention program, and we would go there and see other kids with more obvious delays and issues and dysmorphic features, and early young parents that don't have a lot of experience with this or family history. We were kind of looking at our kid and looking at those kids and going, this just doesn't fit. And that was kind of her life story, was doesn't quite fit. And at 3, her doctor said, okay, let's go do this full thorough testing, and we'll test her hearing, and we'll do a psych test, and a developmental pediatrician will look at her, and we'll do the whole thing. And we're like, okay. And I think back then, she's 19 now. So back then, my familiarity with genetic testing was like, oh, it's thousands of dollars, and it's for genetic disorders. And genetic disorders means you look at a person and you see, oh, you've got something genetic. What's the name of it? And it wasn't the other way around, which is, I don't see anything. Let's use genetics and find out what it is we don't see. And so I, of course, with lots of regret, never pushed that idea of genetic testing. I looked at my pediatrician as my partner and my guide, and we went and did this testing that he suggested. And at the end of all that testing, we ended up with a report that said, by 1 point, your child is on this autism spectrum. And they're at the mildest end, but by 1 point, they made it onto the spectrum. And we were like, what does that mean? Like, she refused to do things for you that she would have done for us, because she doesn't know who you are and she's uncomfortable here. And, so that 1 point, that means nothing. And so that's when she got an autism diagnosis. That was her first diagnosis. Although, like, I guess you could go back and go, yeah, she was being observed as having developmental delays prior to that. We got this diagnosis of autism, and it meant nothing to us. Back then, which now, so that would be 16 years ago, it wasn't what you always hear now of like, it's so helpful to get that because you get all these services. We didn't feel like we got a lot of services. We literally got a printout with a bunch of websites, and none of the names of them were familiar to me. None of them meant anything. And I also didn't relate to this diagnosis. I just felt like it didn't fit. And like Robert was saying, there's this huge spectrum of kids, and how on earth can one website tell me what to do with my child, as well as a more affected child? Like, I just still felt like I was on my own. So on my own, I worked with a group that does this kind of like homeschooly therapy approach, where they meet with you and your child. They, evaluate them on all of their different strengths and weaknesses. And they give you this program and say, now do this at home. And like, one of the very first things was to hug her 50 times a day. And it was an emotional connection, and it was like building up that physical input of sensory, and, but it was, and then 50 is not crazy on this list of all these things we had to do. And we did that for a couple of years, and she was 5.5, and she started having little spells where she'd like look up in the middle of me talking to her, and then she'd carry on. And I had no idea, no medical background. So I asked the developmental group, and they said, well, she's nonverbal, so she's pausing to think. That is how a nonverbal person goes. And then they carry on, and okay, but they became more frequent. And then one day she climbed up on a stool to get a cup out of a cabinet, and she fell. And we're like, whoa. She was not thinking that, so we very easily were able to record one of those and send it to the pediatrician and said, hey, we don't feel right about this. What's going on? And he said, oh, let's get you to neurology. And he was, with that video, he was able to get us in from a Friday to a Monday. We went to neurology, and they quickly said, let's do an EEG and see if this is some seizure activity. They did it. They said, yep, this is called absence seizures. And then they said, oh, let's do an MRI and make sure there's not a big tumor or something that's really obvious that we could detect. And so they did that. And as they were preparing to do that, the physician's assistant said, I've heard that it's appropriate with kids with these kinds of delays to also run a spectroscopy at the same time, or an MRS, which is a readout of different chemicals in the brain. And they did that. And typically there's a few really big peaks that are obvious. And one of them is creatine, and she had no creatine peak. So we were able to roll into the genetics world and got referred to a local expert who's dealt with a few kids with creatine deficiencies. It's super rare, and he did the genetic testing and confirmed your child has this disorder. And guess what? If we would have detected this at birth, your child would be fine. So that's the story of my other child with this disorder. It's called GAMP deficiency. Is we knew about the possibility, it's a recessive disorder, and that he might have it when we decided to have him. And sure enough, he did. So we started him, which is, the treatment is ridiculously cheap. It's cheaper than diapers or formula. It's creatine and 2 other supplements that you can buy over the counter, and mix it with water and give it to your kid 4 times a day. And he is almost 11 now. And he's a typical boy. He's not disabled. He's not having any seizures or anything that looks like a seizure. He should be independent and totally fine. So I think, there's 2 ways to look at promoting a child who has any developmental issues towards, let's get testing. I think the old school thought was, oh, it's really expensive. And from our experience, a lot of these work out. And that's what we kept being told was, some kids just develop at different paces and all of that. And I think now the concept of it's really expensive and let's see, we just don't have time. We don't have the time. And it's not humane. It's not fair when we know that there are things that could be detected that you could give that kid a much better start in life if you would just order the testing. And the testing is so much less expensive now. And I like, even if the family's on Medicaid, I know in Utah, Medicaid is supporting genetic testing. Like there's just no excuse to have a child with developmental delays that are, persisting. Like I understand there's differences in rolling over and sitting by a few months, but when you get along and you see a pattern, I just feel like you run a test and then you have a clear conscience. We ran tests, we didn't find anything. Now we see how it works out. The other thought is often, well, I mean, even if we find something, there's nothing that you're going to be able to do. That's not true. There are many, many, many rare disease groups. And I love Robert's story of the awesome support he got. Even if there's not a cure and a magic pill, support is everything. Knowing is everything. Stopping just beating yourself up and going, why can't I get my kid to develop? Why, it must be me as a parent. Like I've got to try harder. That's not fair. And it's not fair to the child, because you are missing out on the appropriate interventions. And sometimes it's not medicine. Sometimes it is just physical therapy and speech, but being able to tell the physical therapist and the speech therapist and the OT, like, here's what we're dealing with. Oh, this is creatine transporter and we don't have a treatment, but now like what's going on in their muscles, and kind of what's worked with other kids, and you just get such a better leg up. Even if the news is, I'm sorry, there's nothing we can do, it's just a different life for the family to just get that diagnosis. So I think being hesitant with diagnoses, and I know the other hesitation is, oh, we might uncover something, or, oh, we might, we have to get consent, and that's complicated, and I have to educate families. I mean, find your resource then. Find your 15-minute educational video that you make every parent watch. Get your consent form put together. Check these off. These should just be tools in your clinic that are ready to go. And find your testing company that you can partner with, that how to bill with, and maybe you can find a company that will handle the billing and all of that. But there's too long of a wait with geneticists with kids with developmental delays to say, I'll refer you, and let them stand in a line for 2 years, when a clinic can order some of these simple tests, even if it's only a panel that matches the symptoms that you're seeing in that kid, like a seizure panel. There's orders that can be done. And I know, we've piloted such a program here in Utah and asked our pilot clinics to try this, and they made some diagnoses there in their clinics and changed some lives. So it's worth that extra effort. And once you've done that and you've learned the system, I don't think the effort is as extreme as it sounds. So there's my story.
Thank you so much, Heidi. We appreciate your leadership in Mountain States on the Utah team, but we really appreciate you being here today to tell your personal story and how it has impacted your family, both your children, and great advice for clinics. That's really the whole reason we're doing this Time for Genetics initiative, as you know, building on the developmental delay algorithms and the Ehlers-Danlos algorithms, and really trying to find ways in the Mountain States where families don't have to just stand in line for years and years on end. So we are thankful for our pediatric and primary care providers who are participating in this program, and hearing your all stories is a big part of that. So thank you for sharing today. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Adrienne and ask if she's ready to share her story, and I will spotlight you and stop spotlighting Heidi. There you go.
Hello, my name is Adrienne. I'm here in Colorado. My son is 16, and like Robert's son, he also has Dup15q syndrome. And Dup15q syndrome is a large chunk of the 15th chromosome. So we have a large spectrum of kids as far as how effective they are. And so my son lands somewhere in the middle of that spectrum. But when he was born, he was different than every other child that we've ever known. And we kept telling the pediatrician, he's different than every other child that we've ever known. And they're like, oh, you're just new parents, and kind of brushed us off. But by the 7-month checkup, he's like, I see what you're seeing now. So we were able to get into Children's Hospital here in Colorado quickly. had the assessment and for developmental pediatrician, and she luckily ran a genetics test while we were there and called us in 2 months later and told us about Dup 15q. He has Dup 15q syndrome. Had never heard it before. And so it didn't mean a lot to us. I mean, I remember the day. I can almost even remember what she was wearing. I mean, that's how imprinted it was in my brain that day. But she said when he was, 11 months old, she's like, just to let you know, the A diagnosis is out there. And she was saying the A diagnosis is autism. And I knew autism. I think the whole movement of the autism awareness was starting up at that time. So that was my main focus, was autism. And for the next 2.5 years, I was bound and determined to cure my kid of autism, and did every crazy therapy that you can think of. And he just wasn't responding the way I was expecting, or, any treatment I was doing wasn't happening. So I said, maybe I should look into this Dup 15q thing. And went to the website, and it was like, check, 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 check. This is my son. And so there was my answer. And like Robert said, our kids do have their own flavor of autism. They do have all of the, motor, repetitive motor movements and communication issues. And, my son is nonverbal. But he's very social. He looks you in the eye and whatnot. So the autism diagnosis, when he was diagnosed at 20 months, was a lot more devastating to me than the Dup 15q, because I knew what autism was. And, that I just flew off the Dup 15q, and the day he got diagnosed, I was, on the floor. It was a hard diagnosis to come by. And so I think that, the advice that I would have for PCPs, I want to hear more about Heidi's program in Utah regarding testing, because here in Colorado, we have a wonderful hospital here, but you're talking at least a year out as far as appointments, and kids just can't wait that long. And so I would say to PCPs, or pediatricians, first of all, listen to your parents without judgment. We're not crazy. We know what we know. We know our kids best, and follow up. If you suspect something is going on, and the parents suspect something is going on, follow up with that. And just try to cut some of that wait time down a little bit. We didn't face a lot of barriers as far as the diagnosis goes. The explanation, I think, was difficult, because we got, I think, a page printed out from Unique when he was diagnosed for Dup 15q. And maybe that was why we didn't take too much consideration into the genetic diagnosis, because we weren't giving the information, that, this is what you should be looking for. This is what you should do. We were kind of running blind at that point as far as the genetics go. I knew much more about autism at that point than I did anything about the genetics. But, I've kind of thrown my life into the Dup 15q world. I now work for the Dup 15q Alliance and intake new families into this world, and kind of set them up on their journey, hopefully in a good path, and give them some education and some hope regarding the diagnosis. It's not an easy journey. There's a lot going on with the Dup 15q, as far as, we've had every test known to man. And the future is still unknown. Yeah.
Thank you, Adrienne. Thank you so much for sharing your story. Adrienne actually connected us with Robert at one of our genetics summits. And so we just appreciate you coming and sharing your story and your leadership going forward now, helping other families. I have one question for you, just based on your story. So you were saying you got the Dup 15q diagnosis first, but because you didn't have much information on that, it really wasn't on your radar. Is that kind of what you're explaining? But when she said the A diagnosis is out there, that's where your attention turned.
Right. Just because I wasn't educated as far as the DUT15Q, and even the doctors didn't really know. We went to the geneticist and we got, a 2-page printout from Unique, and we didn't get a lot of information as far as the DUT15Q. And we are, working hard to change that as far as, getting more awareness for this. It is the most common genetic diagnosis in autism. They're saying between 3 and 5%. And so our numbers are growing. We're still working on the prevalence of DUT15Q, just because so many kids now are getting tested that are autistic. And so it's a wonderful step forward as far as their treatment and care. We're also trying to get a 15Q onto the newborn screen panel. So we're working hard on that, just because the early intervention is so important. Our kids are very prone to infantile spasms, and we didn't know anything about infantile spasms. And I guarantee you, my son was having infantile spasms, and they were diagnosed as delayed startle. And so, that could have, affected his diagnosis or his prognosis, where we're at today. It could have changed if we would have known.
Thank you for adding that. Yeah, very, very important. I think all of you have mentioned early intervention, and that's definitely an area Mountain States is focused on raising awareness too of early intervention professionals, so they can be partners in helping families get to genetics if that's warranted too. So thank you so much to all three of you for sharing your stories. I would love to open the floor up for questions. We have some folks joining us, so I want to see if anybody has any questions first. If not, I will jump in with some. So are there any questions for Heidi, Robert? That's okay. I got you, Robert. Heidi, Robert, or Adrienne? Let me take the spotlight off so everybody can see one another. Amanda, did you have anything specific you wanted to ask? If not, I'll jump in with some questions.
I guess just like logistics wise, I'm curious, would parents rather get that diagnosis sooner over the phone, or just get the phone call of like, hey, I want to talk to you about your genetic testing results. Can we schedule an appointment? Like I never know how parents receive the, hey, come in phone call versus the, I want to tell you right away, but then it's not as personal,
I think that's a great question. Do you guys each mind taking a turn answering it? I think that would be great to have all your perspectives. Go ahead.
I'll go quick because I gotta fly. I think the phone, it's an excellent question. I mean, I'm like, wow, yeah, really. I think I would rather know sooner, and then have the person maybe frame it well enough that the physician just, hey, we did find, I do think he has ASD or something. I don't think it's that serious or whatever. There's a lot more to it. I don't want you to get excited, but I didn't want you to have to wait till the appointment to find out, something like that. I don't have a good answer to that one. I would want to know sooner. The way I found out wasn't the best, but it's better than him calling me and scheduling an appointment for 2 weeks out, or I got a cancellation at the end of the week. I need to talk to you. I'm not going to get anything done all week anyway. So. All right.
Thanks for sharing, Robert. Yeah, thanks for your time. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Amanda, for caring enough to join us.
Yeah, thank you. Heidi, do you want to answer Amanda's question?
Oh, I think it depends on the circumstances. If you're looking at your schedule and you're not going to be able to get them in for 10 days, and that may cause more anxiety, but I do understand wanting to have the family come in and talk to them face to face, because there's always that, like in newborn screening, like I know they often say, don't Google this, just come in. But, like, and inevitably families Google, and the first thing they see is the bad stuff, and they get excited. And I don't know, I found out our results from the spectroscopy at the end of the appointment, because I requested the records, and it wasn't like results. It was an observation from the technician that said, noticed absence of creatine peak, possible creatine deficiency. And so I hit Google, and I can't say how other people would feel. I saw that 2 out of 3 creatine deficiency types had a treatment. So I was really excited, and I was thinking, I hope it's a treatable kind. But I can see that if I had discovered, oh, this is indicative of something that there's no treatment, and it's just bad news, and I don't know how to process this, and there's no one here to support me, I can kind of see that being bad. So I think the sit down eye to eye is nice. And if you can do it quickly, I kind of think it's better, not because of a mistrust of parents, because I do think parents can go and research and learn and process this, but just that first introduction, I don't know. Yeah.
Great answer. It depends, right? It depends. How about you, Adrienne? Would you agree, or what's your thoughts?
I agree. I think it depends. Both of our diagnoses were done in person. And so I don't know what it was like to receive that phone call, really, that here you go, and then go Google, like Dr. Google, especially in our case, just because there are so many duplication types of DUP15Q, and there's so many different outcomes of DUP15Q. So I think that being able to ask our questions and get them answered in person is really important. And I think 16 years ago, when we had the genetic diagnosis, we didn't get a lot of answers. And I think that did not set us up very well. So if you are going to give that diagnosis, just make sure that you have done a little research, and so you can educate the parents.
Great point. And I thought of something else you said, Heidi, about in the informed consent process. It might be a good thing to even add to asking a parent, hey, we're going to be doing genetic testing. How would you prefer I tell you the answers? Are you okay if I find something to give you a call and then follow up, in person? Sometimes it's really just asking the parents what their preference is up front, kind of setting those expectations too, right? That okay, I'm following through on what you told me would be best. It might not be still ideal at the time, but at the same time, you're honoring their preferences. So might be good to weave that in to inform consent. Go ahead, Amanda.
I like that a lot, of adding that into what your preference is. Good thought.
Yeah. And since Heidi brought it up, we do have a resource on informed consent if anybody's watching this in the future. And that is one of the barriers we have heard from primary care providers is the informed consent process and the education process on genetic testing. So Mountain States does have some resources about that and for folks on that. So if anybody's watching this later, please reach out to us for those. So one other question I have is, Heidi, I was going to ask you, since Adrienne brought it up about newborn screening, would you expand a little bit on how your family's story has translated into newborn screening? Because that's another area that I think is expanding and growing these days. And so would you maybe want to talk about that just a little bit?
Yeah, boy, I could talk about that for a couple hours.
I know you could, just a Cliff Note version.
So we're in Utah, and probably everybody or anybody that would watch this would know Dr. Longo and Dr. Pasquale. They're very strong leaders in the community, especially in newborn screening. And I almost feel weird telling this story on their behalf, but I think the story goes that they, Dr. Longo had been seeing my daughter for several years, and then we had my son, and he was then following my son, and that there was a conversation of, wow, like this is one of those disorders where there's such a big change when you diagnose it and start treatment early. And Dr. Pasquale did all of the work to look at newborn blood spots and pull my kids' newborn blood spots and some others that they were able to get a hold of. And this is where I'll go on a tangent right now and say, if you're in a state that is thinking that they don't want to keep their newborn blood spots, I think it's a huge mistake. You need those, and you don't know which kids have a disorder even. So if you say, well, we'll keep the ones from the kids that test positive, well, what about the kids that have disorders that you weren't testing for? You don't know they're positive yet. So thank goodness Utah had blood spots and that they could turn back to those and go, okay, let's pull these out of storage because we're going to do a study and we're going to advance things for this disorder thanks to these samples. So anyways, they used the samples and they did a big screening and they figured out, oh, okay, like we can see that for kids who have this disorder, this is what their test would look like. And they established a screen. And then they went to the Utah Newborn Screening Advisory Committee that consults, that advises the state and recommends new rules in the state to add disorders to what the health lab will screen for. And they said, check this out. We've developed this. It works really, really well. We should do this. And sure enough, it got passed and they started screening in 2015. And then I got involved with the charity that's associated with the disorder in 2016. And there was a nomination that Dr. Longo put forth, and we were his supporting organization on it, to have the disorder added to the federal recommended list. The federal government does not control newborn screening in the states do, but they do have a committee that puts together a list that says, hey, we've vetted these disorders and we really think they fit our criteria. They also establish their criteria. So sometimes it's, we have another creatine deficiency, creatine transporter deficiency, that does not have a treatment currently. And unfortunately, we can't advocate for screening of that, even though we know it would be really beneficial to the parents and the children in all the ways I said before to get that earlier diagnosis. Newborn screening is very focused on, let's find the disorders that if we find them now, we know that it'll make a big difference. And I think partly that is because it is hard to expand that screening. And I understand that some disorders, you can't just use the existing technology and add to it a little bit, tweak it, and keep screening like you can with GAMT. You actually need like a whole nother person to stand there and work a whole new instrument. You might need another drop of blood, and I think newborn screening is kind of at this point now where there's so many disorders that are being discovered. There's 7,000 rare diseases, and we're all going, hey, you should screen for this. I wish I could have just known from the beginning. Why do you put me through this? You had a sample from me. I think they're to the point where it's like, yeah, we better figure out a genetic method to checking these samples, because the biochemical is limited. It's very effective, and in fact, it shouldn't go away. But I think that it sounds like really newborn screening is going to move in that direction, and it may first be an opt-in program where people that are wanting to advocate for early diagnosis but know they don't fit the criteria start really pushing for testing companies to make this available directly to the consumer. Or in other countries, they are looking at doing this and screening for a limited number of disorders, but it's much, much more reasonable and easy to say, add my disorder to your genetic screening than it is your biochemical, because it's just so difficult and such a hard. So we're finally approved. We're waiting literally any day. November 12th, we were due for a signature from the Secretary of Health to just make it official that we're on the RUSP. I don't know why that hasn't happened yet.
And the RUSP stands for Recommended Uniform Screening Panel, and that's the federal list that
Yep.
Heidi was talking about, just for anybody that's listening that doesn't know that terminology.
Yep.
Go
But
ahead.
I would say for Adrienne, and I'm interested to hear where you're at in that process, but it is not an easy process. Yeah.
And Adrienne, I have a question for you as we wrap up the hour. I have heard from different self-advocates who have autism, things that are against genetic testing. And so with your story being so focused on the autism first and then kind of wrapping back around to the genetic testing, what message do you have for those folks, or maybe pediatricians out there that are like, this is not a good thing for the autistic world or individuals with autism? Do you have a message for those folks? I've just been hearing more chatter about some negative opinions on genetic testing. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I have a lot of thoughts on that. And so unfortunately within the autism community, it's almost like, there's not any other disorder that I can think of that there's so much turmoil and so many differing
kind of
opinions.
Polarity, right? People
Yes,
people at all different angles. Yeah.
Yes. And so, my son would be considered more on the severe end or of the autism spectrum, which I know that, the self-advocates are against ableite and putting an, ableist label on anybody. I think that they have a lot to say. I've learned a lot from the self-advocates. I think that they are great at getting services for people that are on their end of the spectrum, but they are trying to talk for everyone on the spectrum. And so my thing is, it's, as far as the genetics go, they don't understand that everything that DUT15Q also has, including, the autism, the heart block or the, the seizures, SUDEP. There's a lot of things that go into DUT15Q that just a typical person with autism does not have to deal with. And so
a lot of medical
medical. Yeah. And so it's important to get that genetic diagnosis. I know that the majority do not have anything genetically that we can detect at this time. That's changing. Technology is changing constantly. So, I just, like I said, I've learned a lot from self-advocates because my son is nonverbal. But I think the genetic testing is so important to detect kids like mine that have all these other medical issues.
Great. Thank you for sharing that. I appreciate it. Amanda, do you have any other questions before we wrap up the call today?
No, just thank you to the parents for sharing their stories. It's super helpful for us as providers. So I know the rest of the providers in my clinic want to watch at another time. So thanks for recording it as well.
Yeah, no worries. I'll be sending out a link. And how about you, Michaela? Did you have any questions for our guests? I know Robert had to jump off, but.
No questions. Thank you so much for sharing your stories. We really appreciate it.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Thank you both. Any questions for each other? It sounds like you guys want to connect on a couple things. So both Heidi, I'll just mention this at the end here. They both mentioned it, but they don't give themselves a big enough pat on the back. But both Heidi and Adrienne are family leaders in their respective organizations and really great resources for families. So as you are doing more genetic testing in your clinics, if you run into any creatine deficiencies or DUT15Q, please feel free to reach out to Mountain States. We're happy to connect you directly with them so that they can connect with the families that you're serving. I know they both would be happy to talk with either physicians or families. I'm pretty sure. I'm not speaking out of turn for that.
Anytime.
Sounds good. All right. Well, thank you guys so much for being here today. Thank you for sharing your stories, and thank you to our clinicians that are on live today and will be watching in the future. Talk to y'all later. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye. Thanks.